All right, for our lecture on rebellions from 1750 to 1900, let's start by looking at imperialism in France. And this could be imperialism in Europe for all European countries, but we're going to use France as our example. So I'm just going to give you a few facts, not everything about this time period. One is that in France, in countries like Spain and even Britain, this was a time when there were many absolute monarchs. This is a time when there were many absolute monarchs. And monarch just basically means a king or a queen. In this time, mostly kings. And absolute means they had almost absolute power, which means you had to listen to the monarch, again, mostly a king. An example up there, this is the guy right here, showing off his legs. That would be Louis XIV. Louis XIV was an absolute monarch of this time. Why did he dress like that? Because he was trying to show how rich and powerful he was. So, Louis XIV was an absolute monarch who would have said he had a divine right to rule. He ruled by divine right. Divine right means that the belief was his power was given to him from God. Speak Spanish, divine looks a little bit like Dios. Divine right. Right to rule from God. Now think back. This basically means that God's given him permission to rule. This is a lot like China when we talked about the mandate of heaven. How in China they believed their emperors were chosen to rule by God and God gave them permission. That's one connection that we look at here. Another one is he was actually called the Sun King. And it's kind of close to even going way back when we talked about Egypt, that they believed their rulers were more powerful than regular people. So the belief was if you went against him, you were actually going against God. And yes, this was a Christian nation. So how did these royal monarchs and their empires become powerful? One of the big ways they became powerful was because of their raw materials. Raw materials which were like sugar. Tobacco could be another example. And sugar and tobacco were grown almost completely by slaves from Africa. Like we talked in our last chapter, who were brought in to different areas like Brazil, Jamaica. Here we see the island of Hispaniola, where many Africans were brought in, and their ancestors still live in these places today. This would be Dominican Republic. That side of the island, we talked about David Ortiz, his ancestry last chapter, and the other half here would be Haiti. And we're going to talk about a revolution that happens on this island, actually led by slaves and ancestors of slaves during this time period. All right, so colonization and imperialism. These two words almost mean the same thing. Almost mean the same thing. This is a time period where Europeans are still taking over many lands, taking the resources, and becoming rich from these resources. Imperialism means basically the spreading of an empire. Imperial empire. France takes over this half. Spain takes over this half here of this island, for example. Y por eso muchas personas aquí hablan español, as we talked about last time, because during this time period, Spain had a large empire, and France will as well, and so will England, which explains why we're speaking in English in this class. Next, our next context is looking at inequality in France. So you would think, with France having this empire, that life would be good if you were an average person in France. It wasn't if you were average. France, like much of Europe, goes through industrialization. Industrialization is basically taking goods, having them made by machines instead of being handmade. Pretty quick definition. There's a lot more to it than that, but we'll be quick here. So industrialization is when goods are made by factories and machines using steam power. And what happens is the population of Europe increases. Population of Europe increases and grows. And there's advancements in agriculture. Not as many people need to be in the farms. So more people start living in the cities, closer together in cities. And many people are working factory jobs, long hours. And in France at this time, we'll see France be divided into class division, and are divided into 3 estates. It's basically 3 different classes in their social structure. So this would be their social hierarchy. So we see one of the estates is the clergy. The clergy or the church. This would be church leaders, your priests, bishops. That's one estate. Another estate is the nobility. And this goes back from feudalism times. But the nobility are like not the king, but they run large pieces of land, have a lot of power. That's these 2 estates. And then we see the third estate is everybody else. Pretty much everybody else. Those are your farmers, your common workers. We see a soldier in there. This would be the third estate. And in France, they have votes. But the representatives of the church got 1 vote. The representatives of the nobility got 1 vote. And the representatives of the third estate got 1 vote. Is this thing looking pretty equal here? Is this person a lot more powerful than that person? I think that person's considerably more powerful than that person. This is a huge population. Most of the country, about 97% of the country, was in the third estate and got 1 vote. So what happened in France was, for the most part, the clergy and the nobility would vote the same way. And the third estate would always lose. So guess who got taxed? Guess who had to pay taxes? The third estate had to pay taxes. Was the nobility taxed? No. Nobility, some of the richest people, no taxes. Actually, the richest people, because that's the king. The church, which also had a lot of land and money, were they taxed? No. So the third estate, which is the majority of people, but they don't have the majority of land or money, they're the ones being taxed the most. Another way to look at the hierarchy, if you have a triangle, the third estate, the other 2 estates, and the king is on top, being the person you can never question. Let's get to one more. And let's talk about, in this time period, the role of women. The role of women. The Enlightenment will influence many women to start fighting for their rights. The Enlightenment will influence many women to start looking for their rights and fighting for their rights. This will be the beginning of feminism. And again, feminism is just basically the idea that women should be treated equally. It's the idea that I believe my daughter should have the same rights as my son, basically. Or any woman should have the same rights as a man. Or as Olympia de Gauss, who was a French woman, we'll study about said male and female citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, must be equally admitted to all honors, positions, and public appointments according to their capacity and without other distinctions, besides those of their virtues and talents. And for having the radical idea that women should be equal, she was beheaded. She was beheaded during the French Revolution, which we will talk about. So women are asking for equality, but they are experiencing resistance to that. There's a lot of resistance to having women be equal. But eventually, many of these battles will be won, not all of them. And at the end of this era, we'll start to see women having the ability to vote. At the end of this era. All right.